Well, welcome everybody. I'm Tanya Rosenblatt from the Economics Department, and I'm very happy to have Erin Krupka here, who comes to us from the School of Information at University of Michigan. And she's an experimental behavioral economist and does work, among other things, on trying to measure ethical behavior or unethical behavior as well in the financial services sector. And this is what she's going to talk about tonight. This lecture is sponsored by the Economics Department, the Women Leadership Consortium, Women in STEM Series, and the Committee on Lectures. And one of the important things that I wanted to highlight here, the characteristic that Erin and I share is we're both professors in economics and we're both female. And if some of you who are students in economics and you want to think about, whether you want to pursue a career in economics as a female, there are, first of all, only 30% of women who choose to become undergraduate majors in economics. So that's very similar to mathematics. When you look at the graduate programs, there are about 30% of women in graduate programs. Out of them, in academia, there may be 20% assistant professors. And when you look at the higher ranks, it's been getting better in the last maybe 10 years. But when I started in academia, there were only 5% full professors who are female, and now it's about 10. So women still seem to be very underrepresented if you look at the economics profession within the universities. If you look outside of universities and think about the financial services industry, there are only 5% of women who are CEOs of big companies. If you look in politics, you will also find that sometimes women are quite underrepresented. But one of the important things for us is to see that actually women can do very well in many of these professions, and we would like to see more women. So I'm very happy to see Erin here becoming a role model for you. And I know you're not all female here, but you can be also very supportive of all the other females that you see who are trying to enter the professions that they traditionally are not in. And to say one more thing that is inspirational about Erin is that she was not an economics major as an undergraduate. Erin started as a comparative literature major. And she decided that she wanted to do economics, and here she is.
Thank you very much. It's true, and I was comparative literature and at one point quite fluent in Russian. No more. It's all gone out my head. So this study has a rather lengthy title. I actually like the one that we came up with for the talk, but this one is very descriptive. So this is a multi-method approach to identifying norms and normative expectations within a corporate hierarchy. And I'm going to use the financial services industry. I'm going to set the setting for this research in the financial services industry. And it's joint work with Stephen Burks, who's at the University of Minnesota Morris, as well. So ethical norms in general have been recognized as an important influence on behavior, and their cultivation is embraced as a legitimate business goal. If you need any testimony to this, you can look at any number of myriads of courses trying to teach future business leaders ethics in business schools. The reasons why it's thought that ethical norms and the cultivation thereof in businesses are so important has to do with the fact that, or with the idea that perhaps minimizing misconduct and deviance will minimize turnover, will minimize monitoring costs, and create conditions where the wrongdoers, the few that are there, will possibly be uncovered or pointed to by others. And more generally, I should say, when I approached the company in particular here that I'm working with and several of the companies that I work with now, I talk more broadly even about generally thinking about the kinds of risks that you're exposed to. And companies of all kinds do risk assessments and risk analysis. But this is a risk that I spoke with them about. I said, this is a risk that lurks within. And at the time that this research was begun, I didn't need to say more. This was in 2007, right around when things started to unravel, and Enron and the likes were very much in the forefront of people's minds, and they were very concerned that that these few bad apples could, in their company, even with the best of intentions, let's assume these companies have good intentions, and management has good intentions, that even there could be bad apples that would really, really expose them to significant risks. And so these companies were very, very clear and very motivated to understand this problem, this type of risk, and uncovering how. They said, well, how would you figure this out? Okay? So, and they, I explained to them, as I argue also in my research, that there are significant challenges to research in the area of ethical misconduct, and in particular of not just the misconduct, but eliciting the norms, the underlying value system that would underpin and give rise to this misconduct. So a few of these challenges are things like eliciting truthful responses. Do you take bribes? Nope. Okay, so a survey is going to be tough, right? Selection. The problem that when as an example, in other research, the more common mode for doing this type of research is to send out surveys to companies and to query the employees about their perceptions of the ethical climate in the corporation. Problem is that the problem with that particular method or approach is that, of course, those people who are engaging in misconduct may not be likely to answer your surveys if you send them out. This is what economists tend to refer to as a selection problem. Another problem with sort of significant challenge in this area, besides eliciting truthful responses, besides getting everyone or those that you'd like to, or besides avoiding selection problems, is linking the ethical values or the perceptions of what those the ethical norms and climate is in the corporation with behavior. Okay? And that would be important for testing if there were any of these relationships that we think about, such as if there were a notion of that ethical climate gives rise to whistleblowing, as an example, right? So how would you test whether this in fact were the case? And in addition to not just linking ethical norms to behavior, there are yet two other challenges that one can unpack within that problem, which have to do with whose norms are you going to measure? Will you measure leadership's norms, or will you measure the norms at the employee or floor level? And if so, which ones matter for behavior? Okay? So all of these, I would say, constitute significant challenges to research in this area. So there is much research, though. There is quite a substantial amount in seeking to relate ethical norms to behavior in an organization. I would argue one must not only answer which norms, but also whose norms influence behavior. And there, the previous literature, which employs some of the techniques of survey design, which I'll review in a moment, to elicit these norms, finds both positive correlations between ethical leadership and behavior among subordinates, and positive correlations between ethical behavior of peers and one's own behavior. So again, this sort of suggests that either multiple sets of norms matter, or some norms may be more important. But again, it's unclear at this point, though we have some evidence that both types of norms, leadership's and peers' norms, affect behavior. A separate stream of literature yet from this identifies not just the group's norms, whether those are the peers or the leadership's norms, but also the individual's norms, which I'll call the personal opinions. So again, you are posed with the question, is it the perception of the peers' norms and what do my friends do, and what do they think is okay? What do my bosses think is okay? Or what do I think is okay? Okay? So you're again posed with the question, or presented with the question, which of these matters for behavior? Okay? And again, there is literature that suggests that there is a correlation between, as an example, my personal norm and the alignment of that norm with some set of values in the organization, and satisfaction and turnover, both things which are costly. Turnover in particular is costly for a company. So in sort of summarizing where we're at a bit in this literature, there is a notion that it is extremely important. There are several sets of studies, many at this point, that suggest that leadership's norms matter for my behavior as an employee, that my peers' norms matter for my behavior as an employee, and there's yet more literature that suggests that my own norms and the value alignment between those norms, mine and those of my peers and those of my leaders, matters. So the question is, when and which? So what I'm going to do in this paper, and indeed I'm only going to present this today, but in this research program, is I'm going to present results about on-the-job ethical norms collected at several workplaces of a major U.S. firm in the financial services industry. This industry provides advising and planning investment services to the mass affluent, most likely none of us ever in our lifetime, but people who have a lot of money and would like to have advice on how to invest this money given specific goals for, say, retirement, etc. The annual revenue of this particular company and its branches is about $1 billion a year. The particular subjects that participate in this study are financial advisors and their corporate leaders, so the employees and their leaders. What we do is we implement what I consider to be a novel research design, and it's one that I've developed over several years now, which I call a norms elicitation protocol. This protocol we adapt in this research to distinguish between norms among different groups, addressing the question or allowing us to address the question of whose norms influence behavior. We adapt it to distinguish between different norm constructs, norms of the personal norms and group norms, social norms, and I'll get into the definitions of these shortly. And that allows me to address the question of which norms influence behavior. And we combine this protocol, this elicitation protocol, with a survey and an experiment to obtain within-subject measures. That's going to allow us to look at whether the norms affect behavior, at least in both stated intentions and in a controlled experiment. What we find, or what we identify, is an important new relationship between group norms, namely the relationship between the alignment of agreement of group norms and personal norms. If you're an organizational theorist or work in organizational theory, then you will have heard of this idea expressed in the construct of organizational fit, okay, the fit between an employee and an organization. We are also able, with the results of this research, some of which I'll show you here, to diagnose if there are misalignments between these values, the causes of these misalignments. As an example, do they result from a failure to communicate? I, as an employee, simply don't know what the norms are, and therefore I look out of alignment. Or is it the case that I know exactly what you at the management level would like my norms to be? We just don't have those norms at the employee level. These two different causes for what I'll characterize as misalignment in ethical norms between management and employees will give rise to different implications for how you would solve these things. In communication failures, you would need to engage in information campaign. In the case of an underlying disagreement about norms, one obvious candidate for addressing those misalignments would be to use incentives. So they have very different implications from management's perspective. And finally, in this paper, we're, I think, the first to provide a methodology, namely the norms elicitation protocol, to identify ethical norms. To identify ethical norms in general, and in particular to identify ethical norms in this industry. And if I have a chance at the end, I'll talk about some ongoing work that we're doing. But the main point here, if you're familiar with experimental economics, one of the favorite places we like to go to test our ideas and to run our experiments is with you, the students. But of course, I couldn't possibly elicit financial services ethical norms from you, the students. I actually need the employees of the financial services industry to do that. And so one thing that we contribute here is not just a protocol for identification of norms, but a beginning at laying bare the norms that this industry has. and of course, doing so on what I'll show you in a moment are very sensitive subject matters. So what I'm going to do now for the rest of the talk is define ethical norms, share with you the experimental design, and I'll take a few, the experimental design will take a bit of time to develop some intuition on, so I'll spend a bit of time on that. I'll relate very briefly the hypotheses to you, and then share with you the results. So I'm going to define ethical norms in the following way. An ethical norm reflects a socially shared agreement regarding the appropriateness or inappropriateness of a particular behavior in a situation where another's welfare is directly affected. Now, I've underlined three very important characteristics that make something an ethical norm as opposed to, say, to a moral norm or as opposed to, say, to a social norm or more broad category of social norm. And this, I should say, is not my definition. It's a definition shared by many, and I've put up several references here. And depending on what field you're coming from, you will recognize either economists in this collection, you will recognize organizational theorists, you will recognize psychologists, and I think maybe even political scientists somewhere in there. So this is a definition of ethical norms that is widely shared, and I'm going to highlight three things for you. One, the notion that an ethical norm reflects a shared agreement, joint recognition of what is appropriate or inappropriate for a behavior, okay? In a situation, and then we're going to look at just situations where another's welfare is directly affected, okay? So this definition, and in particular these three properties, give rise to three, let's say, implications for how we ought to go about looking for and measuring ethical norms. The first implication is that an ethical norm is a social construct that involves joint recognition by group members that a particular behavioral rule exists. That is to say, if you don't know that a behavioral rule exists and you don't believe your group members, or you know and your group members don't know, then I would say that there is no norm there. So there must be joint recognition among the members of a particular group that it exists. In other literature, Schelling, Mehta, Sugden, Cameron Fair, various folks have argued that coordination games lend themselves in particular to environments where you need to rely on joint or shared notions. So you can use coordination games to lay bare or identify shared beliefs or shared, in this case, norms. The second implication that comes out of this definition is that personal normative opinions, which I will switch between calling personal norms and personal opinions, can vary from views that are understood by group members to constitute the norm. To give you a quick and dirty intuition on this, I spent 2 years living in Germany, and I can tell you that my personal norm for crossing the street when it's a red light is, why not? I ought to just cross if there's no cars coming. I can also tell you that I recognize that there is a joint belief among Germans that one ought never cross the street on red, okay? And so the norm, I can hold both a personal norm that says, I personally have no problem with crossing the street on red, and I can at the same time recognize that there is a collective understanding among the group of Germans, that there is a strong norm prohibiting this behavior. Okay? So you can see that norms, personal norms and group norms need not coincide, though they can. All right? And below I have the definition for you of personal norm. This is from psychology. Personal norms can be defined as self-expectations for behavior constructed in specific situations on the basis of internalized values. Okay? The third implication that comes directly out of this definition is that what is considered ethical, an ethical norm, can vary from group to group. All right? So let me just review then, when I go back to this definition. Socially shared agreement over behavior where another's welfare is directly affected give rise to these three implications. The first implication tells me how I ought to go about measuring norms. Okay? I need to measure joint recognition, and there's literature that suggests that I can use coordination games to do this. So the first implication is one about where and how I ought to look. The second is, again, an implication that suggests I ought not measure personal norms. That is, I cannot simply go around and ask all of you to tell me how okay a particular thing is, like crossing the street, and aggregate those up, because that is not measuring joint recognition. That is an aggregation of personal norms, and those are different. And finally, the implication that I ought to identify the reference group. If I ask you, is cheating okay, and I ask you among students, versus I ask you to think, do you think faculty think cheating is okay, you can immediately see that for the same situation and the same question, the reference group matters. Okay. So I would argue then that we have growing knowledge of the interplay, summing up the literature, we have growing knowledge of the interplay between norms and behavior, and this is expressed in the sophistication of the constructs themselves. As an example, this notion of even distinguishing group norms from personal norms, it's also expressed in our theory, which I don't cover here. Both the theory and the constructs, the sophistication of these constructs, demand measurement techniques and research designs that generate appropriate data for testing. Okay? And this is where this paper enters. Provided one has a reasonable method of capturing social appropriateness, well, you're on your way. Okay? So let's see if we can figure one out. So norm identification, how is it usually done in the literature? There is a significant and important set of work that relies on surveys. And most of this, you will see, comes out of management or business schools and is conducted, for the most part, by a broad class of psychologists. The advantages to survey approaches, where I mail out surveys or I even go in and administer questionnaires, sometimes there are conversations with management over the phone and things like this. The advantages to survey approaches is that they are adaptable, cost-effective, and they are infinitely scalable. The problem with them is they are not what economists consider incentive compatible. That is, if I ask you, do you think it's okay to take bribes, you really have no incentive to tell me the truth. Okay? And that's a real problem if I'm trying to get at anything sensitive. Okay? So in particular, this type of technique is not incentive compatible with the revelation of true beliefs or preferences that are not connected to observed behavior. Well, there's another technique, which is where mostly experimental economists work, and this has to do with laboratory experiments where we vary experimental conditions to reveal behavior consistent with a preference for norm compliance. This technique has the advantage of being a direct measure of the behavior, because remember, we want to look at behavior and we want to look at norms. So we get really good measure of behavior, right? It's incentive compatible with the revelation of true preferences over choices, but not over norms. Norms in this environment are only indirectly measured, and the problem with that is that we fail to distinguish, as an example, between norms, personal norms, social preferences, collective habits, and perhaps more importantly, we fail to be able to pick up norms that prohibit behavior. If I measure behavior and I use that to figure out what a norm is, if some behavior is not done because there's a norm against it, I will never measure it. Okay? So this gives rise to what economists think of as separate econometric identification of preference parameters that is not possible in this environment. In practice, neither the laboratory nor the survey approach does or cares to distinguish between norms of different reference groups and different norm constructs, norms, personal norms, and group norms. So what we're going to do is try and remedy a little bit of that. And I'm going to now describe the experimental design, and I'm going to talk about how we did this and with whom we did it, and then talk and sort of think of that as describing the process that generates my data, and then I'm going to show you what we do with that data. So we had 3 modules that we used in our experimental design. The first one was that we elicited ethical norms. The second module is what we call a behavior experiment, where we measure subjects' behavior in a game where there's incentives to lie. We call it the advice game. And in a third module, we use what is the typical survey approach employed by that first group of psychologists. So we're interested also in capturing a lot more qualitative data on perceptions of ethical norms than we can with this very careful metric that we're going to use. And we're going to connect all of these together and see what we can learn. So I'm going to describe now Module 1 to you. In Module 1, where we elicit the ethical norms, we describe a scenario including the available actions The scenarios we develop with focus groups. So I met with a bunch of sort of higher level and CEO level management and asked them to think about what were the concerns they had at the employee level. What types of problems did they worry about? And we then sat around and developed various scenarios of types of choices and decisions that their employees were likely to be facing on any given day where there was an ethical conflict. That those members who participated in our focus group were very committed. I would say they were sworn to secrecy. They understood the importance of it. There was no swearing of secrecy pacts or anything of this sort, but they understood not to communicate what was being discussed with their employees. That would have really screwed things up. But they were also very dedicated to the process. It took many, many hours to do this. So let me give you a scenario. Now, I'm not going to read this. I'm going to tell you the story. The things that are in red are sort of important pieces of the story. One scenario that folks were really worried about is the following story. So remember, I call up, and I'm a very wealthy client, and I have a set of, so the advisor goes through a process of eliciting my preferences for how I want to invest money. And then we have to sort of formalize everything, okay? And so there's a bunch of paperwork. If you've ever bought a house, you know it's quite a big stack of paper that you have to sign when you buy a house. It's about that size when you do this type of exercise. And on each paper, the client needs to initial that they have read and understood the contents of that page, and then at the end you sign the whole thing. Now, one thing that happens sometimes is that clients inadvertently sort of scrunch papers together, and so papers get missed, so some papers don't have signatures. A contract that does not have signatures on every page is not valid, okay? And so this is a case where a financial advisor, and it's a very lengthy process to go through with the client. It takes a long time. And so this story is a case where the financial advisor notices that his client has not signed on one of the pages. It turns out this happens quite a bit, and it turns out that one of the things that is common, a practice amongst advisors, some advisors, perhaps not in these companies but elsewhere, is that they hold up the signed page to a window, and they put the unsigned page on top, and then they trace the signature. Okay? That is not okay, turns out. Now, in this story, David tells Tanya, David is an advisor and Tanya is an advisor, and David tells Tanya that this is exactly what happened and that he signed for the client on this one page. This is pretty mild because keep in mind, the client really wants all of these pages signed. He's not doing anything that's not something that the client is already wanting. But David is worried that if he has to go back to his client and bother him again with something he messed up on, the client will be quite angry. And I should say we tested these, we didn't just develop these with these focus groups, we also then tested them with a subset of advisors and asked whether they thought that these were realistic concerns and situations. And they all said these were very, very true, hitting close to home. So in this story, this is not a question about whether what David did was appropriate. David did something that was inappropriate. This is a question about what Tanya does in response to David telling her. Okay? So Tanya can do several things, and I'm just going to suggest, again, you don't really need to read through these, but let me just suggest, let's see, where is that? Here we go. That the top, what I've done here is order them from, very good, very bad to very, very desirable from the management's perspective. So Tanya nods after she hears the story, but does not say anything to David, and she doesn't report him. And then we have various versions of this. Here's one in between. Tanya says she doesn't think that initialing for them was the right thing to do, so you get the social sanction from the peer, right? But she says she doesn't want David to do that again, or she'll really have to report him to a compliance officer, and then she does not report him. All the way down to Tanya nods, but does not say anything, and then goes and reports him. So that is reporting behavior minus the social sanction. To 6, social sanction. She tells him she's going to report him. It's not okay. And then she goes and reports him. Now, from management's perspective, that right there is the most desirable behavior. Okay? This right here, reporting, is compliance with sort of the letter of the law, but not the spirit. They'd really like people also to sanction each other. And the rest of these are all very undesirable from management's perspective. Okay. So now, we have the scenario, we have the set of things that Tanya could have done in this situation, and then we elicit the social norms by measuring social consensus regarding the appropriateness of those actions, or in this case, behaviors. So subjects are going to be asked to rate the appropriateness of each action. Here's what that looked like. You don't have to read any of this. I'll walk you through it. So this is what they saw when our subjects participated in this experiment. Over here is a list. I've only put 2 of the 6 actions up, but this is a list of the actions. So here's the first one, right? She says, don't, oh, and by the way, what you see here is that we randomize these, right? So earlier I had them ordered, so it was easy to sort of see the progression, but they're randomized what order they are on this list. So here's an example of an action, and subjects then have to think about, well, do I think it's very ethically inappropriate, a little bit somewhat ethically inappropriate, or do I think it's somewhat ethically appropriate or very ethically appropriate? Okay, so they have to think about this scale. And what we're going to do is give them incentives not to tell us, remember, what they think, but to tell us to match others' responses. So they're trying to figure out what they believe most others most others believe is the rating, or what most others will rate that action as. We're going to vary the target for them, so we're going to say, tell us what you think most other financial advisors would think is appropriate, what that rating is. And then we're going to ask them, tell us what you think management, a corporate leader, would rate, how they would rate that action. And then we're going to say, we're not going to give you any incentives, and we're just going to say, tell us what you think for the same scenario. So they see this scenario 3 times. 3 times we read it to them, 3 times we ask them to play, to indicate, either in a coordination setting where they have incentives, which I'll talk to you about in a moment, to coordinate with a financial advisor on a response, or to coordinate with a corporate leader. So let me walk you through how that works. So we're back to this scene, right, of the 2 actions, and I'm trying to decide for this first action, Tanya tells David she doesn't think initially was the right thing to do, but doesn't report him. I'm trying to think about not whether I think it's okay, but I'm trying to think about whether what another financial advisor is, how another financial advisor is likely to rate that action. Remember, that other financial advisor, whoever I'm going to be matched with, is also trying to do that. Okay? So this is a coordination game. And the way this worked was that subjects, imagine you guys are my financial advisors. You're all trying to fill this out. We take all of your forms, we go in the other room, and we pick your response, and we pick another's, and we look and we say, right, here's what you wrote. I think the first action is very ethically inappropriate. I think the second one is somewhat ethically appropriate. The other guy's responses that I picked randomly out of a hat, who's also a financial advisor, guess what he said? He said, yes, number 1, I think also, I believe most people believe that most financial advisors believe that is very ethically inappropriate, and so they get a match, and they were paid $10 for any rating that was matched. Okay? But unfortunately on this one, your guess about what most other advisors said, and the other person's guess about what most other advisors rated that action as did not match, and so you do not receive payment for that response. Now then we run the whole thing through again, except now you're trying to think about what corporate leadership's responses were. Okay? And again, you are rated, you are paid, whether if you give the same response as corporate leadership's, knowing that corporate leadership is trying to think about what your response is. And finally, we run through it again, and we say, there's no incentive. Your responses will not be compared to anyone else. Please tell us what you personally think. I can't incentivize that because I can't match you with yourself, so I can't pay you for that one. All right. So then we had this rating scale. So we have these 4 categories, right? Very ethically inappropriate to very ethically appropriate. We transform those categories into a scale that takes on positive values for a very appropriate behavior and negative values for inappropriate behavior. Note that there is no ethically neutral category. So if we get something that on average looks neutral, that's simply because the average result arises from equal numbers of positive and negative evaluations. So who are our subjects who are playing these games or doing this exercise with us? The majority of our subjects are the employees. They're financial advisors. Some of our subjects are management level. We're going to call them corporate leaders. They come both from branch levels, regional vice presidents, senior vice presidents, and one CEO in this case. So let me give you a visual way to think about this coordination exercise. I try and come at it a couple different ways so that you have some intuitions for what I'm doing here. So when the financial advisors, if you're a financial advisor and you're coordinating with you're trying to coordinate your responses with other financial advisors, I'm going to call that the actual norms among financial advisors, those responses, okay? When corporate leaders are trying to coordinate their responses with each other, that is, corporate leaders are trying to match responses with other corporate leaders, then I'm going to call that the corporate leaders' desired norms they wish that their employees had. Because remember, the scenario is about David and Tanya, who are employees. So corporate leaders are trying to tell us, this is how I wish what I wish the norms were, the desired norms. When corporate leaders coordinate with their employees in this task, then I'm going to interpret that as corporate leaders' beliefs about the financial advisor norms. And finally, when the employees are coordinating with management, I'm going to call that the financial advisor beliefs about corporate leaders' desired norms. Yet a different way to think about it is in the following sense, which is that you have financial advisors playing with financial advisors, and those are going to tell me the actual norms. Corporate leaders coordinating with corporate leaders tell me the desired norms. And then on the cross sections, corporate leaders and financial advisors playing with each other, you get beliefs about each other's norms. Okay? Okay. So we have this initial module, which we're going to use to identify group-level norms. We're going to use it to distinguish group-level norms from personal norms. And then we're going to look at correlations with behavior and with stated job-related sentiments. We use 3 vignettes. I've only shown you the one, which is the whistleblowing one, where Tanya has to decide whether she's going to tell on David. But we also look at a conflict of interest and what we call a convenience lie, which is something where I'm not harming somebody, but I'm also not being perfectly upfront in my communications. I'm only going to cover the whistleblowing case for tonight. The show-up fee for these guys was $70. You walk in our door, no matter what happens, you get $70. There was a 25% chance that you would be paid out on Module 1 at $10 a match. If you matched all of your responses in all 4 coordination tasks, then, in all 2 coordination tasks, then you could earn up to $320 in addition to the $70 you receive for walking through the door. In the subsequent behavior games, which I'll talk about at the end, you could earn either $50 or $100 for sure. So the expected earnings of anyone who participated in this experiment were $250. The most that anyone could earn in this experiment were $540. These are very large stakes. But these people that we're asking to come and participate with us in this experiment earn a lot of money. Okay? It takes a lot to get them to walk through the door. So we're trying to address selection problems, the problem that you only get a certain type walking through the door, both by eliciting the norms in the way that we do, by incentivizing those, and we're also trying to address it by giving salient, what economists would call salient incentives that they care about. All right. So I'm not really going to read through all these hypotheses. I'm going to give you a sense of them. The blue is sort of the sense. If you want to read along, that's fine. So the hypotheses are hypotheses about what I expect to see from the data generated from eliciting the norms. Okay? I expect to see that corporate leaders will align with what I'm going to call ex-ante evaluations. This hypothesis I need to explain a bit more, which is that we have, remember the focus group that we worked with, those were very high up leadership groups, and they had very specific desires for how those actions would be ranked. And those we're going to call our ex-ante identified norms. Those are the norms that exist, that is the ranking that company would like the appropriateness to have on those actions. So we're going to call those our ex-ante identified evaluations. I'd like, action number 1 to be considered completely unacceptable and action number 6 to be considered very acceptable, right? So they ranked those for us, so we knew what those were. So those corporate leaders who played these games with us, we expect their responses to align with those ex-ante identified evaluations or rankings, if you will. We also expect greater financial advisor alignment for extreme actions. We don't think people are going to be too confused about the extremes. It's the middle, the murky gray, where we expect to see less alignment. We also expect to see normative alignment across the hierarchy. That is, we don't expect financial advisors to be completely oblivious, right? But we do expect roughly for them to recognize that unethical activities are less appropriate than ethical or more ethical activities, right? When there is misalignment between the corporate leaders and the employees in terms of what they perceive the appropriateness ratings to be, then we expect those misalignments to occur when there's an interest conflict, and I'll show you where that is in a moment. And finally, we expect to be able to diagnose the misalignment, and I'll share with you that shortly as well. I'm going to talk about the attitudes and behavior. So again, to give you a sense, if there is misalignment, then we expect that misalignment to be correlated with job satisfaction. That is, those who perceive that employees' norms and management's norms are out of whack, that they will express larger dissatisfaction, okay, at the job. We also, in the behavior experiment, where remember there are incentives to lie, we expect that differences, perceptions about values or norms at the employee and norms at the management level, if you perceive those to be out of whack, we also predict that you will be more likely to engage in dishonest behavior in our experiment. Okay? So now let me show you the results. First, and this gets to our introduction about women, there's a funny story here, which is that we had a long discussion after we got all of this settled about what we were going to do and the scenarios and all of this sort of thing. We had a long discussion about what were we going to report. Okay, so this company in particular was very concerned that if we published data, somebody would be able to find out. Well, what if their advisors were cheating rotten scum, right? Ooh, that would be really bad press for the company. And what if somebody could figure that out? Okay. And so they were very concerned about being able to identify, say, particular branches or being able to identify their entire company as a whole. They were also worried about other kinds of problems. What if they discovered, as an example, that women were more likely to engage in gross violations than men, as an example, let's say, right? What if we found a gender effect, that women were more dishonest than men? So we went back and forth for a really long time about this, and we agreed that we would not report, we would be able to use all of those, think of those demographic coefficients or demographic variables in our regressions, but we would not be able to report any of the results on gender or race. Well, when we showed up, I thought this was all very humorous because we ended up having almost no women and almost no race diversity in the subject pool. So this gets to Tanya's introduction, which is as you go up the corporate hierarchy, there just are fewer and fewer, there's just less and less diversity. So I thought, we spent about 4 hours making sure we had our bases covered, only to find out it wasn't really necessary. All right, so this is some information about who these guys are. And this is the full distribution of the data that we elicited in using the norms elicitation protocol. I'm going to walk you through what I think are the most important pieces here. First, you see on your left the set of actions. Again, I've ordered them in terms of the ex-ante identified categorization, right, from least appropriate to most appropriate. And then what you see here are the mean ratings that financial advisors matching with financial advisors gave, and corporate leaders matching with corporate leaders. Here you see the full distribution of data. Okay, those are the full distribution here. So negative is very inappropriate, all the way over to positive, which is very appropriate, right? So very inappropriate to very appropriate. And similarly for the corporate leaders. And on the very last column, what you see are rank sum tests for looking for differences in distributions. So let me now walk you through the first result, which is that indeed the corporate leaders' ratings match the ex-ante identified ratings. That is, everyone. There's very little variance here. They're very clear. No, these are completely unacceptable behaviors, right? Here, this is very unacceptable. And they're very clear that these shaded ones down here, the lighter grays, are the ones that are identified as okay and most desirable by the focus groups that we used. And they're very clear on that as well. Okay? So leaders' ratings match ex-ante identified ratings. The second thing you see is that there's a high degree of coordination on ratings on extreme actions versus less extreme actions. That is, here are the percentage of subjects who gave this rating. So there's a high degree of matching here and a high degree of matching on the very inappropriate action. So the very appropriate action and the very inappropriate action, financial advisors are clear. Okay? You also see what we're going to call a strong pattern of general alignment. Okay? That is, you see a general understanding that for all the actions in gray, which corporate leadership has identified as very undesirable, okay, every variation, very undesirable, you see generally that they fall, that financial advisors realize that, in fact, these are very undesirable behaviors. And you see that the two lighter gray actions, which are identified as okay and most desirable, indeed are getting positive, ratings that say appropriate or very appropriate. Okay? So you see a general alignment between advisors' norms and corporate leadership's desired norms. However, what I've done here, by the way, is I'm going to take these means, okay, here, and this mean here, and I'm going to plot them now, where the actions 1 through 6 are on the x-axis. The dark lines reflect the actual advisor norms, and the light lines reflect the desired norms that corporate leadership has for advisor behavior. On the y-axis, I have the appropriateness ratings, and you can think of sort of at the bottom, this is really bad stuff, right? And at the top, it gets better and better, and at the top, that's really acceptable, okay? Very appropriate behavior. And so what you see here in this graph, in a way that I think is better than in the distribution table there, is that there are actions where there is significant misalignment in in the advisor's norms and the desired norms of corporate leadership. So, what do we see here? Synthesis, right? We see corporate leaders matching ex-ante identified rankings, consistent with hypothesis 1. Financial advisor alignment is strongest for the most extreme actions, and there's strong general alignment, that is, financial advisors are rating things as inappropriate, where corporate leaders are also rating them inappropriate. But there is significant misalignment between financial advisor actual norms and corporate leadership's desired norms for these middle actions. All right, so that is, we can say clearly that the financial advisor norm is to report David. That comes out of this data, no matter what. But we also observe that financial advisors are not uniform in their agreement, and the intensity with which they hold this norm as a group is below corporate leadership's expectations. So now what we want to ask ourselves is, can we use some of the other information to identify the source of this misalignment? Is it because financial advisors simply don't know what's expected of them? Or is it that they simply don't agree? So what we can do, let me go back and just say, we can look at beliefs that corporate leaders have about desired norms, and we can look at beliefs about leaders' desired norms that the advisors hold. So this first instance, we can get a sense of whether there's miscommunication or misalignment. So what we see here is a plot, same axes, but we see here are advisors' beliefs about what corporate leadership wants the rankings to be, right? And then you see, and here you see leaders' desired norms. What you see is that they're right on top of each other. What that tells me is that financial advisors are not misinformed. They know exactly what corporate leadership wants here. Okay? So that's not, those differences are small. We can also look at the actual norms that advisors have, and we can look at what corporate leaders believe those norms are. And again, we see that the differences are small. The way you interpret that is that leadership understands that advisors hold different norms. They're not confused about the fact that at the floor level something else is going on. So, we can diagnose the source of misalignment. Financial advisors clearly understand corporate leaders expect Tanya to blow the whistle, and that any choice not involving Tanya reporting him is very ethically inappropriate, according to the firm's leaders. Corporate leaders, in turn, understand that financial advisors have a different norm. Taken together, this is strong evidence that financial advisors are well informed. This is not a communications problem. This is an incentives problem. In other examples in the paper, we show instances where this misalignment comes as a result of communication. But in this case, it's an incentives problem. So now we're going to combine this elicitation with attitudes and behaviors. So we're going to ask ourselves, in essence, okay, you got some norms. What does it matter? Okay? So we're going to devise various measures of misalignment. The intuition on these measures is the following, all right? So we're going to take summary measures of misalignment between the desired norm and an employee's perception of the actual norm. So this is a financial, if you're a financial advisor, these are your ratings, minus the average rating of corporate leaders, okay? And we're going to sum those up, and that's going to give us a sense of the total difference between your ratings, and those of the average ratings of a corporate leader, okay? We're going to take the absolute value of that, and the larger that difference is, the larger the misalignment is, okay? In a similar fashion, we can do this looking at your personal opinion and how that is different from the desired norms at the corporate level, and your personal opinion and how that's different from your peers' norms if you're a financial advisor. So think of these three measures. Let me just give you a different intuition on them. This measure reflects the difference in your perception of the difference between your peers' norms and the desired norms at corporate leadership's level. This measure reflects your personal norms, the difference you have in your personal norms and your perception of the desired norms. And this right here reflects your perception of the difference between your norms and your peers' norms. So are you different from the people you work with every day? Are you different from the people you work for? Or do you perceive that the people you work with every day have different norms from the people you work for? Hopefully one of those three intuitions works for you. So we have two hypotheses. One is that that misalignment on any one of these dimensions will show up, will be correlated with lower job satisfaction, and misalignment on any one of these dimensions will be correlated with dishonesty. Okay? So let's take a look at how we do this. So I'm going to describe now to you Module 2, which is a behavior game, and the demographic survey. The demographic survey is pretty easy. These are job satisfaction questions. They're used all the time in the industry, and they just say, in general, how satisfied are you? Okay? So this is going to be our measure of satisfaction. The advice experiment is a little different. So if you're in my advice experiment, you guys are A's and you guys are B's, okay? So my A's, here's what you read. You B's, you don't get to read any of this, okay? So my A's see the following problem. For this decision task, there are two possible options which yield different monetary payments for you, and one of you, your counterpart B. One of the payments will be paid to you, and the other will be paid to your B partner. The choices are the following. If your counterpart chooses option A, well, you get $150, and the other guy gets $50. If your counterpart chooses B, well, then you get $50, and the other guy gets $150. Okay? These are real incentives that we used here. Problem is, the only action you A's can take is to send a message to the B's who don't know any of this. They don't know the payoffs. They know that a game is being played, but they don't know anything about the payoffs, nor will they ever find out the payoffs associated with this choice. Okay? All you can do is send a message. You can send message number 1, which says A will earn you more money than option B, or message 2, which says option B will earn you more money than option A. One of these is a lie. Okay? In addition, we ask you to tell us whether you believe the person who reads your message will follow your advice. So A's, you just decide which message to send. Now, the B's then get a message. You open up your paper and it says, option A, you will earn you more money. You say, oh, all right, I don't know what option A is, but I'll have to decide whether I want option A or B. And that determines the payoffs. So this is our game where we have incentives for lying. You can think about what you might do in this situation. So here are then OLS regressions correlating measures of misalignment and job satisfaction. So these are the stated beliefs. So here's what we see. We see that misalignment between the perceived peer norms, financial advisor norms, and the desired norms at the corporate leadership level are correlated with dissatisfaction in a significant way. They are also, misalignment also between my personal norm and the people I work for is correlated in a significant way with dissatisfaction. And similarly, my misalignment between my personal norms and those of my peers, the people I work with, if I think I'm different from them, okay, on ethical values, that is also correlated negatively with job satisfaction. Okay? How about on behavior? So those are reported measures. Economists don't like those much. So we throw them in because I think they're good, but economists don't like those. They like behavior. So let's look at the behavior game. So here we see something I think is very interesting. So here the dependent variable is the probability of telling the truth. So I'm measuring the probability that an A tells the truth, okay? And I'm going to look at whether misalignment is correlated with that probability. So misalignment between the perceived financial advisor norms, so your perception of the group norms at your peer level and your perception of the desired norms, is negative but not significantly correlated with the probability of telling the truth. However, misalignment, when you perceive yourself, your own values, to be different from those desired at management's level, that is significantly correlated at a significant level with a decrease in the probability that you tell the truth. Put differently, you're more likely to lie. Similarly, there's a misalignment between personal ethical norms, your personal norms, and your perception of what your peers' norms are. That is also correlated with a significant decline in the probability that you will tell the truth. What I find particularly interesting is the magnitude of these effects. What I see here is that your peers really matter to a greater degree than your perception of management's norms. And that has some intuitive value because you interact with them every day. All right, so let me wrap up. I think this is a novel research design. We adapted this elicitation technique, in this case, this protocol, to identify norms among different groups, answering the question of whose norms influence behavior, to identify different norm constructs, personal norms and group norms as an example, to talk about, or to begin to talk about, which norms influence behavior. And we combine it with surveys and other experimental protocols, in this case the advice game, to look at the behavioral correlates that might arise from these misalignments. We identify this new relationship by which norms affect behavior, namely the alignment. It's the alignment, the matching of your norms and attitudes with your perceived norms of your peers and your leaderships. And we offer an idea about how to diagnose the cause of this misalignment, either through failure of communication or through underlying disagreements about norms. And I'll stop there. I'll leave up future research. I'd be happy to answer those questions and turn it over to the floor for just a few. Good? Okay. You have one? Hi.
I was just curious how many people did lie.
How many people did not? So how many people were honest
Yeah, I was just curious.
I hope I'm right in saying about 78% were honest. I think I'm right in that. Any other questions? What do you think students would do for 150 versus 50? What do you think the lying rate would be? Undergrads. 100% for $100 difference, or what do you think? Don't want to say? All right. Okay, well, I'll stay after if anyone wants to chat, and I thank you for your attention.